Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are your shortcut to being the most informed person in the room.
And today, we are strapping in for a really big one.
We are. We're looking at arguably the highest stakes learning environment imaginable. How modern militaries are fundamentally redesigning human thought itself.
Right, to keep pace with the machine age.
Exactly.
We're deep diving into what this comprehensive framework we've been studying calls the age of cognitive acceleration.
And what does that mean exactly?
It's a time where artificial intelligence, AI, has just profoundly altered the whole temporal structure of decision-making, that traditional OODA loop.
Observe, orient, decide, act.
That's the one. It used to take minutes or hours, maybe even days in some historical context. Now it's being compressed into milliseconds.
And that compression, that speed, it creates this massive structural mismatch.
A huge one.
Technology can observe and collect data at, warp speed, but our human capacity for reflection, for ethical reasoning, for just understanding context, it just doesn't scale that fast.
It can't. And that's precisely the point. The core shift, as all the sources detail, isn't just a quantitative one. It's not about needing more data faster. It's a fundamentally qualitative shift.
Okay, so how so?
The military establishment is rapidly moving its focus from what it used to call information superiority.
Which was basically seeing the battlefield faster than the enemy.
Right. From that to cognitive superiority.
Which, when you break it down, I guess it means the ability to outthink the enemy, not just outcompete them.
That is the perfect way to put it. Cognitive superiority is the ability to reason, to revise your own thinking, and to reflect effectively, all under that compressed time and in highly ambiguous high-stakes conditions.
And this is because the algorithms, the AI, they handle pattern recognition and data retrieval brilliantly. But what do they lack?
They inherently lack understanding, they lack intentionality, they have no moral agency.
So the human leader has to step in.
The human leader must act as a cognitive guardian. They have to ensure that these machine-generated recommendations are interpreted through what the framework calls the irreplaceable filters of doctrine, ethics, and political purpose.
And here's the crucial insight for you, the listener. And this applies whether you're prepping for a high-stakes board meeting or are just curious about what competence really means now. In this new era, simple recall your memory is rapidly becoming an obsolete proxy for competence.
Totally obsolete.
The machine handles retrieval, the truly decisive competency, the thing that makes a human valuable. It's judgment.
That's it.
It's the capacity to question the machine's input, to see the systemic or algorithmic bias, and to reason ethically and logically when that clock is ticking down to zero. That is the scarce resource now.
And that profound necessity, this sort of existential need for disciplined judgment, well, that's the entire motivation behind charting what the framework calls the cognitive continuum.
And that's our mission for this deep dive.
Right. We're going to trace the mandatory institutionalized evolution of these critical thinking skills, step by step, across an entire professional military career.
From the very beginning.
All the way from the foundational training of a disciplined young cadet, right up to the grand strategist who's operating on the world stage.
So let's start at the absolute beginning, at what the framework calls the seedbed of future doctrinal maturity.
The early military schools.
Right. For context, we're talking about these preparatory academies, places in India like RIMC, the Rashtriya Indian Military College, or RMS, the Rashtriya Military Schools, and all the various Sainik schools.
These are basically the feeder systems. They shape boys and girls before they even get to the officer academies like the NDA.
And what's so special about that environment?
Well, these schools function at this unique developmental intersection, right, where adolescence meets highly structured, often very intense training. You've got rigorous drills, collective living, strict hierarchy.
Sounds tough.
It is, but the institutional goal here is actually surprisingly subtle. It's sophisticated. It's primarily about shaping executive function.
What, like in the brain?
Yes, exactly. Strengthening what psychologists call attentional control and moderating those impulsive tendencies that are just, completely normal in adolescent development. They are physically training the brain to be attentive and systematic.
That seems really counterintuitive to me. When I think of that kind of early military training, I think conformity. I think obedience.
A lot of people do.
But the framework seems to directly challenge that popular misconception that discipline is somehow the opposite of curiosity.
It absolutely challenges it head on. The sources are so clear on this. Discipline and curiosity are mutually reinforcing.
How does that work?
The discipline, specifically the drill and the routine, it strengthens what they term attentional stability. And if you have stability in your attention, you can then observe things systematically, rather than just impulsively or randomly. So the structure, far from stifling inquiry, actually provides the necessary procedural bounds for it to happen effectively.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. The discipline creates the focus you need for deep observation. But how do you stop that system from just collapsing into passive obedience, into just following orders without thinking?
That is the critical question. And the key is teaching what they call respectful inquiry under authority.
That sounds like a very fine line to walk.
It's a highly nuanced social and cognitive skill. It's about learning the crucial distinctions between different types of questions, and, just as importantly, when each one is appropriate to ask.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure, a cadet has to learn to distinguish between, say, a clarifying question, something like, what exactly is the time window for us to complete this task? That just reduces ambiguity.
Simple enough.
Then you have a probing question, which starts to test risk. Something like, given the current weather, what specific risk are we assuming with this approach? You're not questioning the order, you're questioning the conditions.
And then there's the most advanced one. And
Yeah, the challenging question. This is where you probe the fundamental framework itself.
Yeah.
Is the foundational assumption that the enemy will attack from the north still valid, given this new intelligence report we just got?
So you're challenging the premise, not the authority.
You've got it. The aim is to reduce executional ambiguity and strengthen the whole team's performance, but without undermining the chain of command. It's about making inquiry safe, structured, and, goal-oriented.
So you're building the muscle for asking the right question at exactly the right time. Let's break down these 3 fundamental habits of mind they try to instill at this stage. It starts with observation, reasoning, and reflection.
Observation is skill number 1, and it's deceptively difficult. It's so easy to get wrong. Cadets, and frankly most people, often confuse noticing something for understanding it, or they confuse their own interpretation for a fact.
So the training has to break that down.
It instills 3 core principles. First, you record the sensory data before you interpret it, just the facts. What did you see? What did you hear?
Okay.
Second, you have to consciously distinguish that raw sensory data from your inference. Was that flash a muzzle flare, or was it just sunlight reflecting off glass? They have to learn that separation. And third, you have to actively identify your own cognitive blind spots.
Blind spots created by what?
Anything. They can be created by external factors like fatigue, sure, but also by internal pressures. Peer influence is a huge one. Wanting to see what your friend saw.
Right. Okay, so that's observation. Let's move on to the next one. Reasoning. This is where they learn to articulate their thought process, right?
Yes. Reasoning requires discipline. You have to form your claims, support them with actual, valid evidence, and, this is critical, explicitly state your assumptions. Cadets have to practice articulating why they believe something, not just what they believe.
And they use a model for this.
A very simple one at this stage, the Claim Evidence Assumption Risk Model.
Why is that so important?
Because by externalizing their internal thinking process, by putting it out there using this simple model, they create a target for correction. Their instructor can see the flaw in the logic, and it's a necessary precursor to the really complex planning models they'll use later in their career, like the military decision-making process.
And the final habit, reflection. The framework says this has to be institutionalized, not just something you do once in a while.
Because reflection is the engine that transforms mere experience into judgment. Without it, you just repeat mistakes.
So how do you institutionalize it?
You build it into the daily rhythm. They use daily journals, short after-action reviews or AARs, immediately after a game or a drill, end-of-day mentor conversations. It all strengthens metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking.
And is there a core question they focus on?
There is. The central question they learn to ask day after day, year after year is this: what assumption did I make today that deserves re-examination?
Wow.
That simple question, repeated over and over, is described in the framework as the cognitive embryo of strategic judgment.
That repetitive, simple question is a powerful anchor. But how do you actually measure growth in something as fuzzy as judgment at this stage? Especially if we've already said that memory recall is the wrong metric.
The whole assessment system has to pivot completely. Growth is measured by what are called lightweight formative indicators. They're focused on cognitive performance, not memory.
And there are 4 of these.
4 key criteria. First, clarity. This is just communication discipline. Can you express your idea without ambiguity? Second, logic. Is your reasoning coherent? Is it valid? Third is breadth.
breadth of thought.
Exactly. It gauges their intellectual flexibility. Are they willing to consider alternatives, or are they stuck on their first idea? And fourth, ethics, anchoring their decisions to standards of legitimacy and honor even at this early stage.
Let's make that more tangible. If a cadet fails on the breadth criterion, what does that actually look like in a practical exercise?
Okay, good question. So it might look like rigidity. In a simulated drill, a cadet is given two possible avenues of approach to an objective. A cadet lacking breadth will immediately select the first, most familiar option, spend zero time considering the alternative, and when they're challenged, they'll just dismiss the second option without any justification. They'll say something like, it just won't work.
And a cadet with high breadth.
A cadet with high breadth would quickly sketch out the pros and cons of both options. Even if they ultimately choose the first one, they've demonstrated that they explored the cognitive landscape fully before deciding. That's the kind of high-impact feedback this system is designed to provide.
Got it. And to wrap up this foundational stage, the framework mentions 5 simple patterns, these microsocratic moves, that prepare them for more complex analysis later on. Can you walk us through those?
Absolutely. These are simple questioning patterns they have to internalize until they're automatic. The first is define terms.
To avoid confusion.
Exactly. To prevent confusion in tactical communication. For example, an instructor might ask, when you say secure the building, do you mean prevent access or do you mean hold it until you're relieved? Those are two very different things.
Okay, what's next?
Number 2 is test assumptions. That's to detect hidden risks. We've talked about that one. 3 is seek counterexample.
Why is that one important?
It promotes intellectual humility. It forces them to find a scenario where their own claim would fail. It stops them from falling in love with their own ideas.
I like that. What's number 4?
4 is trace implications. This one is crucial. It's about revealing second-order effects. In plain English, if you change this one variable in the drill, where does that ripple effect hit 2 or 3 steps down the line?
It's teaching them to think 2 steps ahead.
Precisely. And the 5th and final one is specify observable outcomes. This enables learning and verification. If your desired outcome isn't something you can actually observe or measure, then the lesson from the exercise is lost. You don't know if you succeeded or failed.
And these 5 micro moves, they're the building blocks for everything that comes later.
They are the absolute building blocks that will be used in complex red team exercises and staff planning throughout their entire careers.
Okay, so we've established that the cadet phase is all about turning physical discipline into cognitive stability. Now let's see how they take that stability and turn it into intellectual autonomy as they move up to the National Defense Academy and the other service academies. This is where they become officers.
Right, and the framework defines this transition as the fundamental cognitive transformation of their career.
It's not a shift from obedience to disobedience, you said.
And no, absolutely not. It's a shift from obedience to understanding.
What's the difference?
Cadets obey instructions. They do what they're told. Officers, on the other hand, must interpret and execute the purpose behind those instructions.
That sounds like a huge leap.
It's a leap of faith and a leap of intellect. The officer has to be able to detect the implicit, unstated assumptions of their higher command, identify what constitutes an acceptable risk, and then adapt their actions on the ground without compromising the overall operational design.
So comprehending that intent, the why behind the order, that seems to be the critical bridge between discipline and autonomy here.
It is the absolute foundation of modern decentralized operations. This is exactly where the principles of mission command become essential.
And mission command is built on 3 pillars, right?
3 pillars: intent, initiative, and trust. Intent clarifies the why and provides the guiding framework. Initiative governs the disciplined how.
And you said it's not improvisation.
No, it's discipline deviation that's still aligned with the original purpose. And the 3rd pillar is trust. Trust, which has to flow both ways, up and down the chain, regulates the how far they can push that initiative.
And I can see now, if they don't have this critical thinking foundation that was built in the cadet stage, mission command would become chaos.
It becomes completely unworkable. Decentralization only works if the subordinate officer has the intellectual maturity to exercise judgment under uncertainty. That bidirectional trust is what promotes adaptability, which is just crucial for modern contested operational environments where your communication links are frequently degraded or completely saturated.
This must be incredibly stressful for a young officer. How do they train them to maintain their judgment under that kind of pressure when the cognitive load is so high, especially knowing the adversary might be using AI to speed up their own OODA loop?
Well, they use the OODA loop itself. Observe, orient, decide, act as the conceptual scaffold for the stress training. The real emphasis, the focus, is on the orient phase.
The making sense of its phase.
Exactly. They are taught relentlessly that speed cannot substitute for clarity. The training is designed to manage cognitive load and information saturation through specific techniques.
Like what?
Techniques like chunking, breaking a complex task into smaller, manageable units, doing immediate assumption checks as a reflex, and participating in these rigorous time compression drills where they have to make decisions faster and faster.
So the goal isn't just a rapid decision.
No, the goal is a rapid, coherent decision.
So they're actively trained to modulate their own tempo. How do they learn when it's the right time to speed up versus when to slow down?
They learn to distinguish between what they call predictable, controllable friction, like a muddy road, and inherent high-consequence uncertainty, like not knowing the enemy's location.
Then in those uncertain moments,
They practice slowing down the decision pace deliberately during critical ethical or doctrinal junctures. Those are the moments that carry strategic risk. And at the same time, they learn to accelerate routine actions to buy back that time. This cognitive control is absolutely essential to navigate these fluid tactical environments without losing their doctrinal bearings.
let's discuss the core pedagogy here. How do they teach this in the academies? The framework says it relies heavily on structured reflection and adversarial analysis.
That's where the academics meet the operational reality. They rely heavily on something called case walkthroughs.
So analyzing past battles.
Historical or hypothetical scenarios, yeah. Officers have to analyze them by systematically examining the factual baselines, the underlying assumptions that led to the original plan, the second-order implications of the choices made, and all the risks. This kind of structured dissection prepares them for the rigors of higher-order planning.
And this leads directly to something called doctrine-to-decision mapping. Now, how do instructors make sure officers aren't just retroactively justifying a bad decision with doctrine, but are genuinely using doctrine to generate better options in the first place?
That's the instructor's challenge, and it's a big one. Doctrine-to-decision mapping forces them to make that link transparent. An officer has to justify their tactical actions, for instance, deciding on a specific method of concentration of force, not just by saying it was practical, but by explaining how it's doctrinally sound.
So they have to connect the action to the principle.
Exactly. They must link a doctrinal principle, like economy of effort or maneuver, to a specific tactical choice, and then explain how their choice maximizes that principle. This linking is essential for joint environments, where your decisions have to withstand scrutiny from multiple services who all speak slightly different doctrinal languages.
And to really stress test this kind of thinking, they use red teaming, often through what they call war game injects. Can you give us a concrete example of what a war game inject actually looks like in practice?
Certainly. Imagine a young officer is running a logistic support operation plan for a fictional theater of war. A standard plan might assume 204.7 access to a key seaport to bring in supplies. A red team inject might be a surprise news report flashed on a screen, indicating that a local labor strike has just shut down that port. Or, maybe more militarily relevant, a cyber attack has degraded the port's management system, so nothing can get in or out.
And that throws the whole plan into chaos.
It forces the officer to immediately adapt their plan, justify their deviation from the original intent, and answer that central question we keep coming back to. What fundamental assumption just broke?
And they use counterfactuals, too.
Yes, counterfactual exercises. They have things like, what if the adversary were 10 times faster than our intelligence suggests? Or what if they had access to technology we haven't even predicted yet?
And that's to fight against mirror imaging.
It's the best tool to reduce the insidious risk of mirror imaging, which is the trap of assuming the enemy thinks exactly like you do.
We've established that the officer is a moral agent. The framework is really emphatic that ethical reasoning is inseparable from competence.
It is absolutely core to the entire concept of officership. They have to understand that their tactical decisions don't just affect the immediate battle. They shape the legitimacy and the credibility of the entire nation.
So they train for that.
They are put through intense dilemma-based scenarios that simulate operational pressures, forcing them to practice moral reasoning under fire. The core realization they have to come to is that operational shortcuts that compromise ethics always generate long-term strategic costs. They erode domestic and international support for the mission.
Specifically, the framework highlights a heavy focus on the rules of engagement, ROE, proportionality, and necessity.
These are the three pillars that operationalize ethics on the battlefield. ROE establishes the legal boundaries and preserves legitimacy. When they analyze proportionality, officers learn to weigh the potential use of force against minimizing collateral harm. And necessity demands ensuring that the action chosen is the least harmful option that can still achieve the legitimate aims of the mission.
So every decision has to pass through that filter.
They train to anchor every single tactical decision in that logical, moral calculus.
Let's talk about the planning process itself. The military decision-making process, or MDMP, is used here, but the framework specifically notes its vulnerability to cognitive biases. Before we get to the risks, can you just briefly summarize what the MDMP is?
Of course. The MDMP is the primary, systematic, seven-step process the military uses to analyze a mission, develop different courses of action, or COAs, and then produce an operations plan. It starts with mission receipt, moves through mission analysis and COA development. Then you have COA analysis, which is basically wargaming, and COA comparison. That leads to COA approval, and finally the order of production.
It sounds incredibly structured and rigorous.
It is, by design.
So how on earth do cognitive biases, like anchoring and confirmation bias, manage to corrupt something that's so structured?
Because at the end of the day, it's run by humans, and humans who are under a lot of stress. Anchoring, for instance, is highly dangerous in the MDMP. If the initial intelligence estimate the anchor is flawed, the planning team will unconsciously cling to it, even as contradictory information starts to emerge during the wargaming phase.
And confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias happens when the team starts to filter all the incoming reconnaissance or intelligence data to support the COA that the commander, or maybe just the most dominant personality in the room, preferred early on. The rigor of the MDMP can, ironically, just end up solidifying a bad initial assumption if these biases aren't actively managed.
So how do they mitigate those risks? What stops groupthink from setting in during that process?
The training uses structured tools to force that critical examination. This includes things like mandatory assumption audits, where every assumption is listed and challenged. They use blind briefings where team members analyze information without knowing the commander's preference.
That's clever.
And they run competitive analysis drills. To mitigate groupthink, which is just so insidious and undermines adaptability, they have to create psychological safety and encourage what they call structured dissent.
What does that look like?
Leaders are taught to practice asking, often publicly, what is the strongest, most well-evidenced argument against our current plan? And crucially, the institutional culture teaches them to separate a person's rank from the quality of their argument. You can be the most junior officer in the room, but if your logic is sound, it must be heard.
All right, so we've moved from foundational curiosity to doctrinal understanding. Now, part 3 of this journey brings us to applied analysis. This is at the junior and senior command courses, often taught at places like the College of Combat.
Yes, and this is where judgment is operationalized under real-world constraints.
This sounds like a significant cognitive step up.
It's huge. At the NDA, officers sort of apprentice judgment. At the JCSC, they are expected to master and apply it. They're now facing limited time, extreme uncertainty, incomplete information, and the direct pressure of leading troops.
So doctrine changes its role here.
It does. Doctrine stops being a rulebook that you just cite, and it becomes a conceptual compass to guide your adaptation in the heat of the moment.
And the framework links this stage explicitly to Bloom's taxonomy, the educational framework. How does mission command training align with those higher-order cognitive levels?
Well, mission command inherently demands the highest levels of cognitive function. If you map the learning arc, cadets learn to remember and understand doctrine. Junior officers must learn to apply battle drills. But at the JCSC level, the training has to consistently push them to do 3 things.
Okay.
First, to analyze to identify friction points, centers of gravity, and systemic weaknesses in the enemy's plan. Second, to evaluate it to compare multiple courses of action using clear doctrinal criteria. And critically, third, to devise innovative, intent-consistent solutions, all under severe constraint.
So they have to operate at the top of that pyramid.
Consistently. They have to operate at those top 3 cognitive levels while still maintaining their tactical grounding.
You mentioned that experienced officers rely heavily on pattern matching. What specific cognitive biases impact their tactical judgment when they are actually in command, and how do they train against them?
The primary cognitive shortcut here is something called recognition prime decisions, or RPD.
Okay,
It's the natural human tendency for an experienced officer to quickly match a current situation to a pattern they've seen before in training or on a past deployment, and then instantly deploy a prepackaged solution.
Sounds efficient.
It's very fast, but it risks catastrophic misclassification when the adversary deviates from the pattern. So the JCSC faculty teach them to verify the pattern
How do they do that?
by using quick observable discriminators,
Yeah.
small concrete pieces of evidence that either confirm or falsify their initial mental model. If the pattern is 99% accurate, that 1% error, especially in an age of AI-driven deception, can be fatal. They are trained to slow down their RPD just enough to verify the input variables before they act.
And stress must just exponentially increase their reliance on these mental shortcuts.
It does.
How do they simulate those dangerous stress conditions in training without, causing panic?
They simulate the exact conditions where shortcuts are most dangerous. This includes night operations, severely degraded communications, forced mental fatigue, and intentional ambiguity, what we all know as the fog of war.
And the logic is, since stress increases reliance on heuristics,
Officers have to learn mental resets. They learn structured collaboration tools and procedural checks to manage that cognitive load. They train to achieve what's known in high-risk professions as high reliability, consistent, excellent performance under maximum duress.
to counter those inherent risks, the framework highlights these anticipatory reflection techniques. Let's start with the pre-mortem. Can you walk us through a simple, relatable example of how a pre-mortem actually works?
The premortem is a game changer. It's so powerful because it completely shifts your thinking from optimism to strategic pessimism.
How so?
Okay, let's use a simple example. The vision is to secure a key bridge. A standard risk assessment might identify obvious threats like enemy presence or running out of fuel. A pre-mortem, which is conducted before you execute the mission, requires the team to gather and declare. It is 6 hours past H hour. We have failed spectacularly. The bridge is lost, and we have taken heavy casualties.
You start by assuming total failure.
Total failure. And then, working backwards from that imagined disaster, they systematically identify the most plausible reasons why they failed.
And what might they come up with?
They might identify things like, we failed because we assumed the bridge's structural integrity could handle our heavy engineered vehicles, and it couldn't. Or, we failed because the radio channel we planned to use for emergency fire support was already saturated by an unrelated unit, and we never checked.
Things a standard risk assessment might miss.
Exactly. A standard assessment often misses these hidden internal assumptions because you're focused on external threats. The pre-mortem exposes these fragile, weak points before you execute, and it allows you to direct resources immediately to those fragile aspects of the plan.
That proactively mitigates strategic folly. What about guardrails and branch sequel thinking?
Guardrails are minimal, non-negotiable parameters. They're like red lines. They ensure that all the adaptation and initiative, which is highly encouraged, never compromises the core doctrinal intent or the ethical boundaries set by the rules of engagement.
So they keep adaptation from running wild.
They act as immutable red lines in the heat of the moment. Branch and sequel thinking, on the other hand, is all about building resilience into the plan itself.
Branch and sequel.
Branch thinking anticipates alternative conditions before the mission starts. If the enemy retreats unexpectedly, we immediately branch to Plan B. Sequel thinking anticipates the next step after a success or a failure. If we successfully secure the bridge, the sequel is to immediately prepare for the inevitable counterattack.
Shifting to the pedagogy, the Socratic dialogue here must be really intense. How do the faculty use that structured facilitation pattern you mentioned? Probe, challenge, connect, and reflect.
This four-step cycle is designed to create cognitive discomfort, but within a safe learning environment. It's not about embarrassing anyone. The faculty first probe to clarify the officer's assumptions and surface any cognitive gaps.
Then they turn up the heat?
Then they challenge by introducing doctrinal friction or a complex adversary behavior that wasn't expected. Next, they connect the officer's decision back to the higher purpose, to doctrine, and to the ethical constraints.
And finally,
They reflect to capture the key transferable lessons from that exchange, ensuring the knowledge is portable to the next mission.
and this rapid cycle, it feeds directly into the immediate structured reflection of the hot wash formats.
Correct. The hot wash emphasizes immediate post-exercise critique, no waiting. Officers have to concisely articulate 4 points. 1, what was supposed to happen. 2, what actually happened. 3, why the deviation occurred, focusing on assumptions and decisions, not blame. And 4, what will change next time.
That seems like a great way to embed accountability.
It fosters a continuous learning culture and forces them to own their cognitive performance.
And the reflective journaling, that must shift its focus again at this more senior level.
It becomes intensely analytical. The journals still analyze patterns, but the entries are now explicitly AAR linked. They're converting the collective lessons from the Hot Watch into personal learning pathways.
So it's about personalizing the lesson.
Yes, officers must record which specific assumptions were challenged during the exercises, and that helps build intellectual humility. And crucially, they explicitly map their lessons for transfer to next mission, which transforms reflection from just passive commentary into active preparation for their future roles. They're building a personal database of their own cognitive failure points.
This all sounds heavily weighted toward analytical reasoning. How does the institutional framework make sure that it's reasoning and not simply rank or assertiveness that gets prioritized and rewarded?
The assessment rubrics are the key institutional safeguard here. They explicitly prioritize analytical depths over seniority, or just being the loudest person in the room.
And they use those same 4 criteria.
The rubrics evaluate the same 4 criteria we saw earlier: clarity, logic, breadth, and ethics. But now they're being applied to incredibly complex operational plans. They guide the counseling process by identifying specific, recurring patterns in an officer's reasoning, like rigidity or chronic overconfidence or assumption blindness. And that signals precisely where that officer needs to focus their cognitive training before they step into actual command.
Okay, so our journey is taking another major intellectual leap now. We are moving to the Defense Services Staff College, the DSSC, and officers here have to master operational art and systemic reasoning.
That's right. And this is where critical thinking becomes a truly joint, tri-service operational requirement.
The DSSC imperative, as the framework calls it, is all about synthesis.
It is. All that tactical experience, all the doctrinal reasoning, and a new layer of joint service understanding, it all have to be integrated. Plans at this level must be ethically defensible, they have to be strategically aligned, and they must be jointly coherent.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. Officers have to develop the ability to reason with both precision and breadth, all under conditions of extreme complexity. They're often dealing with 2 or 3 levels of command above them and 2 or 3 levels below them simultaneously.
What are the integrated dimensions of critical thinking that define success at this staff level?
The framework lays out 3. They are analytical rigor, reflective depth, and ethical awareness.
Break those down for us.
Okay. Analytical rigor is about forecasting the second and third order effects of complex operations across multiple domains: land, sea, air, cyber, space. Reflective depth means rigorous self-assessment, recognizing your personal biases, and importantly, the limits of existing doctrinal templates. And ethical awareness ensures that all your operations align with legitimacy and contribute positively to the overarching strategic narrative.
And they're taught simultaneously.
They have to be. Because a brilliant plan that is unethical is still, at the end of the day, strategic failure.
Staff work inherently means you're planning with incomplete information. How do they train for what the framework calls judgment under uncertainty, especially when the risk profile is now affecting thousands of personnel and potentially millions of citizens?
They practice making decisions in high-fidelity scenarios. These involve uncertain intelligence, active deception from the adversary, and rapid adaptation. They use rigorous, structured tools like probability estimates, complex risk matrices, and something called sensitivity analysis to evaluate how robust their plans really are.
And the goal?
The goal is to cultivate judgment that is cautious enough to avoid recklessness, but not so cautious that it leads to strategic paralysis in a compressed, fast-moving environment. They have to learn to decide based on what they know and what they're willing to risk, not what they wish were true.
The framework then operationalizes this critical thinking into a repeatable staff process.
Yeah.
The DSSC critical thinking framework.
Yes, this is a 4-stage cycle. Comprehend, analyze, reflect, apply.
And it's recursive, you said.
Intensely recursive. Officers must first internalize all the information and the context, that's comprehend. Then they break the problem down into its core components. That's analyze. Then they have to critically examine the meaning of it all and all the underlying assumptions. That's reflect. And finally, they use those insights to shape the plan. That's apply.
And reflection is the key.
Reflection is the engine of the whole cycle. It frequently sends officers right back to the comprehension phase, forcing them to reread or reevaluate the intelligence, and that accelerates learning through these systematic feedback loops.
So what is the relationship between doctrine and critical thinking at this level? If they're supposed to be thinking so critically, why not just abandon doctrine altogether?
Because critical thinking needs a foundation to stand on. You can't think critically in a vacuum. Doctrine gets redefined at the DSSC. It becomes a scaffolding system that structures their inquiry.
It provides the tools.
Exactly. It provides conceptual boundaries and tools like center of gravity analysis or identifying decisive points. But critical thinking provides the necessary interpretive flexibility to apply those tools to new and novel problems. They teach that doctrine provides the framework for professional communication, but it is never, ever a substitute for judgment.
The pedagogical logic here, it sounds like it relies almost entirely on faculty facilitation. It's a complete shift away from knowledge transmission to active inquiry.
That's the core instructional shift.
Yeah.
Faculty facilitation is paramount. They often rely on what they call CTQ critical thinking questions to force the justification of every single decision's why, especially in a joint service context where everyone has different assumptions.
And peer learning is vital.
It is. That cross-service dialogue in the seminars promotes joint intellectual discipline. Having an Army officer defend a logistics plan to a Navy officer and an Air Force officer naturally exposes anchoring bias because their fundamental assumptions about terrain, timing, and risk are completely different.
Let's look closer at the 5-step facilitation cycle that the faculty uses to guide these seminars.
This is their method for systematically exposing gaps in reasoning and ensuring that a real deep dive happens. First, they frame the problem clearly, setting the boundaries and the objectives of the planning session. Second, they probe with very targeted questions to expose cognitive gaps and unstated assumptions in the student's initial analysis. Third, they challenge by introducing doctrinal friction, unexpected adversary behavior, or a sudden ethical dilemma. Fourth, they connect. They connect the students' decisions and their deviations back to the high-level doctrine, the ethics, and the joint operational logic. And finally, they consolidate. They extract the specific transferable lessons, the meta lesson, that the students can carry forward with them.
And the institutional commitment to reflection must deepen here as well, ensuring it becomes a command habit and not just an academic exercise.
It absolutely must. Reflection has to become a command habit. So beyond the individual journals that are now documenting incredibly complex assumptions and ethical dilemmas, the DSSC contributes to an institutional repository and digest.
That's that.
It's essentially a library. It's a collection of anonymized reflections, lessons learned, and critiques of courses action from all the past cohorts. It acts as the institutional memory, allowing successive generations to learn from past failures and successes, and it prevents the institution from repeating the same cognitive errors over and over again.
All right, the capstone of this entire continuum is strategic leadership. This culminates at the war colleges and ultimately the National Defense College, or NDC. This is the leap to strategic cognition in statecraft. What defines this vast intellectual transition?
It is the single largest cognitive leap in their entire career. The transition is profound. They move from operational problem solving, which asks, how do we achieve the military objective efficiently, to strategic thinking, which asks, how do our military actions shape political outcomes and long-term stability?
So it's a completely different goal.
A different universe.
Yeah.
Operational art focuses on efficiency and advantage. Strategic reasoning focuses on legitimacy, credibility, sustainability, and critically, avoiding unintended consequences.
It sounds like the very logic of the problem changes. Battlefield logic seeks a decisive advantage.
While strategic logic seeks an acceptable, stable outcome.
Right.
Exactly. Military advice at this level has to be interpreted through a complex political lens. It's constrained by diplomacy, by alliance commitments, by public opinion, and international law. This is where leaders learn that an operational success, say a brilliant tactical maneuver, can, in fact, completely undermine the strategic objective if it generates catastrophic political blowback.
And the framework maps the levels of war to distinct cognitive levels. Can you break down what each of those levels demands cognitively?
Certainly. Tactical thinking focuses on the immediate situations, the here and now, the individual engagement. Operational thinking focuses on systems, connecting those tactical victories across space and time to achieve theater objectives. You know how logistics, fire support, and maneuver all interlock.
And strategic thinking.
Strategic thinking focuses on structures and long-term consequences. It asks, how do our military choices affect the fundamental relationship between states, or the global economic order, or the balance of power 10 years from now? The war colleges are designed specifically to cultivate the cognitive elasticity required to shift seamlessly and rapidly across those 3 levels of thought.
How do strategic leaders ensure they prevent errors at the very outset of a crisis, before a single decision is even made?
Through disciplined strategic framing. This is the critical process of defining the essence of a problem before you even attempt to solve it.
And strategic failures often begin with framing errors.
Almost always. Errors like focusing too narrowly on military means, or mistakenly accepting an adversary's narrative or their definition of the conflict. They are trained to construct alternative frames and anticipate the consequences if their preferred frame turns out to be incorrect. For instance, framing a protracted conflict as a counterinsurgency requires a completely different set of tools and strategic constraints than framing it as a counterterrorism operation.
And the complexity of the modern world, especially with AI influencing everything from finance to information, that requires advanced systems and network thinking.
Modern conflict is entirely systemic. Strategic leaders have to be able to map the nodes, the flow, the feedback loops, and the leverage points in these massively interdependent networks, logistics, cyber infrastructure, finance, alliance structures, information ecosystems.
Why is that network-based reasoning so essential?
It's essential for anticipating cascading failures and predicting nonlinear geopolitical effects. Furthermore, they utilize environmental scanning, which is tracking weak signals and emerging disruptions across the political, military, and technological, or PMT, dimensions to detect threats that are still below the horizon but are potentially catastrophic.
And now moving to the absolute apex, the National Defense College. What does grand strategic reasoning entail that's different from just strategic thinking?
The NDC demands cognitive synthesis at the absolute highest level, integrating all the instruments of national power. This is the famous DIME-T concept: diplomatic, informational, military, economic, and technological instruments.
And this requires, what did the framework call it?
Systems of systems cognition. They are mapping the interdependencies of global alliances, trade ecosystems, supply chains, international institutions, places where small, targeted shifts in one area, say a single economic sanction, can produce massive, cascading geostrategic effects across the entire globe.
That level of thinking must require understanding the adversary in a profound, almost intimate way.
Absolutely. It requires what they call strategic empathy.
Which isn't sympathy.
Not at all. It's the ability to understand how adversaries interpret their own interests, their own historical narratives, and their own worldviews. The NDC uses highly complex simulations and scenario-based planning to train officers to adopt adversary viewpoints without internalizing their values. The purpose is strictly to prevent catastrophic miscalculation based on the false assumption that the enemy sees the world, or risk, exactly as we do.
The framework sums up the requirements for this kind of senior leadership in the triad of strategic competence.
This triad defines the successful strategic leader. First is cognition, the capacity for deep analysis, evaluating risk, framing problems correctly, and anticipating those long-term consequences.
Second is communication.
Right, communication. The ability to articulate complex, nuanced ideas clearly and persuasively to politically diverse audiences, often internationally. And third, and perhaps most importantly, is character. Moral courage, unwavering integrity, prudence, and the psychological stability required to maintain your judgment under prolonged, intense strategic stress.
And even at this apex, reflection remains paramount. They call it metacognition.
Metacognition, or thinking about your own thinking, is the final intellectual firewall. Strategic errors at the very top often stem from deeply flawed, unexamined mental models. Therefore, leaders must continuously track how their own assumptions are evolving over time.
How do they practice that?
They practice multi-perspective reflection. This forces them to track their current assessments from three distinct vantage points: the national view, the military view, and the adversary's view. This constant critical self-evaluation is the key institutional defense against strategic complacency.
We've charted the entire professional career arc now. Let's bring it all together in this unified framework, the cognitive continuum. It's described as a spiraling ascent.
It's essential to view it that way, as a spiraling ascent, not just a simple linear progression. Those core skills like observation, questioning assumptions, reflection, they're constantly revisited, but at progressively higher levels of complexity and scope.
So every transition is a reinterpretation.
Every single transition, cadet to officer, officer to staff member to strategist. It requires the reinterpretation of your knowledge, not just accumulating more of it. The professional evolves from executing tasks to framing problems, and finally to shaping systems across the global stage.
And throughout this entire continuum, from the discipline of the drill square to the complexity of the national security table, 6 elements persist. The 6 universals of military thinking.
Yes, and these must provide the institutional cross-level continuity. They are the anchor points of the entire profession.
Walk us through them one last time.
They are: 1. purpose unwavering clarity of mission and intent. 2, inquiry, that continuous disciplined testing of assumptions. 3, reflection, systematically revising your mental models based on what you've learned. 4, judgment making, informed decisions under profound uncertainty. 5, ethics, aligning every action with legitimacy and honor, which preserves your strategic freedom. And finally, 6, integration, connecting every single tactical act to its strategic outcome.
And those 6 universals ensure that everyone is speaking the same cognitive language.
Regardless of rank, yes.
It sounds like the entire framework exists to ensure that adaptability and innovation are always ethically bounded, even when they're being accelerated by technology like AI.
That is the ultimate existential goal of the whole thing. The framework stresses that adaptive thinking without a moral foundation risks becoming purely instrumental and incredibly dangerous. But at the same time, ethical thinking without adaptability risks irrelevance in a rapidly changing world.
So innovation has to stay aligned.
Innovation, especially in relation to AI and cognitive warfare tools, must continuously align with legal and societal norms.
And what is the lifelong discipline required for senior leaders to maintain this coherence, to act as the custodians of this entire institutional ethos?
It's continuous, formalized reflection. Senior leaders, being the custodians of the ethos, maintain professional journals to track the ethical dilemmas they face and the evolving nature of their strategic worldviews. This institutionalized reflection through journals, strategic seminars, internal critiques ensures collective coherence, stewardship of the profession, and intellectual continuity across successive cohorts of leadership.
So let's wrap this up. We started this whole deep dive by talking about the age of cognitive acceleration brought on by AI and the compression of that decision loop. What does it all mean?
It means that the speed of technology has made human reflection and sound, disciplined judgment the most valuable and simultaneously the most scarce strategic resource that we have.
And this framework.
The framework we analyze today provides the structured, institutionalized discipline necessary to cultivate that judgment step by step across an entire professional life. It ensures that the military doesn't outsource its most critical human responsibilities to a machine.
So it's the engineered countermeasure to the speed of the machine. If the OODA loop is compressed to milliseconds, the reflective pause has to be intentionally engineered, trained, and defended.
Absolutely. The necessity for that deliberate, trained reflection grows exponentially with every increase in information volume and decision tempo.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If military legitimacy now depends on human leaders ensuring that machine-generated recommendations are interpreted through doctrine, ethics, and political purpose, then the military must continuously ask, how effectively can we train our current decision-making cycles to resist the acceleration of folly?
That's a question worth applying to any high-stakes environment.
Indeed. That's all the time we have for this deep dive into the cognitive continuum. Thanks for joining us.